Every night, she locked her bedroom door, and her parents told themselves it was just teenage privacy. But then came the whispers, the flickering lights, and the silence that grew too heavy to ignore. When they finally broke in, they didn't find rebellion or danger. They found a hidden world of sketches, machines, and warnings, guarded by a secret she refused to share, until the moment she returned and said one chilling sentence. You weren't supposed to see this yet. What was she building in the dark, and why wasn't it meant for them? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The first night it happened, they thought little of it. Their daughter had always been a private girl, quiet and self-contained, never the type to demand attention at the dinner table or fill the house with noise. She had turned 14 only a month earlier, and with that age came new boundaries, new signals that she was moving into a stage of her life where secrecy was natural. A locked door seemed almost like a rite of passage. Her mother smiled faintly when she noticed it, telling herself it was nothing more than a teenager learning how to draw lines. But as the days passed, the lock became a fixture of the hallway. Every evening, at almost the same time, the faint click would echo through the upstairs corridor, and the brass handle would resist any touch from the outside. It was not casual, not a once-in-a-while expression of needing space. It was routine, deliberate, and unbroken. Meals would be left outside her door, the trays collected silently at night without a word. When her parents knocked to ask how she was, she answered with short sentences, always assuring them she was fine, always promising to join them later, though she never did. At first, the father laughed it off, brushing away the unease that grew in his wife's expression. She's just being a teenager, he said, settling into his chair after work. Remember how you wanted space when you were her age? It's normal. But the mother could not shake the feeling that this was different. The lock wasn't simply about privacy. It was about control, about keeping something carefully guarded behind that door. In the evenings, when the house quieted, they would hear her moving about upstairs. Sometimes it was a steady scrape of a chair against the floor. Other times it was softer, like pages being turned or objects set carefully on a desk. Once, in the middle of the night, the mother swore she heard the faint metallic clink of tools. The sounds were never loud, never careless. They carried a strange rhythm, as if she were following a plan too intricate to be left to chance. The father began to notice smaller details. The way their daughter carried herself at breakfast, tired but oddly satisfied, as though she had stayed up late working on something important. The way she guarded her backpack when she left for school, sliding notebooks, and so quickly neither parent could glimpse what she had been writing. And always, without fail, the way she returned home, vanished into her room, and closed the door with that unmistakable sound of the lock turning. By the second week, the lock had transformed from an annoyance into a presence. It seemed to define the upstairs hallway, drawing their eyes every time they passed. Relatives who visited commented on how little they saw of her, how she seemed to vanish after saying hello. The parents made excuses, speaking of schoolwork and adolescence, but each time the words felt less convincing. One evening, after she had retreated into her room, the mother lingered by the door. She pressed her ear gently against the wood, holding her breath. There was movement inside, steady and purposeful, but too muffled to understand. She knocked softly, asking if everything was all right. A pause followed, long enough to raise goosebumps on her arms, before a voice came, calm, rehearsed, almost mechanical. I'm fine. Please don't worry. It was the same answer every time, but something in its sameness unsettled her. There was no frustration, no irritation at being interrupted, just a measured calmness that seemed out of place for a girl her age. At night, when they lay in bed, the parents began to whisper about it, their voices low as though the locked door might somehow be listening. What if she's hiding something dangerous? The mother asked once, staring into the dark. The father didn't answer immediately. For the first time, he had no easy reassurance. The lock had become more than a teenage habit. It had become a wall inside their own home, and behind it their daughter was building a world they could not see. By the end of the month, the house had adjusted itself around the silence of that door. Meals were quieter, routines reshaped to accommodate the absence of her presence. But in both parents' minds, Unease grew heavier each day. A locked door could mean nothing, or it could mean everything, and the not knowing was beginning to feel like the most dangerous part of all. It began quietly, so faint at first that the parents wondered if they were only imagining it, a sound in the stillness of the night, when the rest of the house had gone silent, and even a clock on the landing seemed hesitant to tick too loudly. From behind their daughter's locked door came the smallest disturbances, soft scratching like pencil against paper, then the occasional muffled thud, as though something heavy had been shifted from one side of the room to the other. At first, the mother told herself it was homework. Perhaps their daughter had fallen into the habit of studying late into the night, a habit that would explain her tired eyes in the mornings and her growing reluctance to join them for breakfast. But the noises did not match the rhythm of pen on notebook or the scrape of a chair against a desk. They were stranger, harder to place. One night, close to midnight, the father awoke to a different sound. It was not scratching this time, but a steady hum, low and mechanical, rising and falling as though some kind of small machine had been switched on. He lay in bed for several minutes, trying to convince himself it was just the heating system struggling against the autumn chill, until he realized the sound was too contained. It came only from one place, the locked room down the hall. He sat up listening, and when his wife stirred beside him, she asked what was wrong. He only shook his head, unwilling to voice what he was hearing. Over the next week, the sounds multiplied. On some nights, there were muffled voices, faint enough that they could not make out words, yet distinct enough to know they were not random noises. Sometimes it sounded like her daughter was speaking to someone in whispers, other times as though recordings were being played at a volume too low to fully catch. Once, the mother leaned into the hallway with the lights off and stood still, waiting, and she was certain she heard laughter. Not her daughter's usual laugh, but something restrained, almost rehearsed, as if it did not belong to her at all. The parents did not speak of it at first. Each time the subject rose to their lips, they swallowed it back down, unwilling to seem paranoid, unwilling to give voice to the growing unease that haunted the house after dark. At the breakfast table, when their daughter appeared briefly with her plate, her hair unbrushed and her eyes shadowed by sleeplessness, they exchanged glances over their coffee cups. Their daughter moved quickly, eating little, offering fewer words than ever before. When she disappeared back upstairs, the silence she left behind was heavier than the sound of her door clicking shut. The father began checking the locks on the front and back doors at night, a habit he had not kept in years. It was irrational, he knew, but the muffled voices gnawed at him. If she was speaking to someone, then who? And if there was no one else in the room, then why did it sound as though she was never alone? The mother grew bolder. Twice, she crept down the hallway and pressed her ear against the painted wood of the door. Both times she heard something that turned her stomach. Once a faint metallic tapping, like tools striking against each other, and once a distinct were a motor that started and stopped in short bursts. She whispered her daughter's name, but there was no reply, only the immediate cutting off of sound, as if someone inside had frozen the moment they realized they were being overheard. At dinner one evening, she finally asked a question that had been growing inside her. "What are you working on at night?" she asked carefully, her fork resting untouched on her plate. The girl looked at her with calm, unreadable eyes and said only, "It helps me think better when it's quiet." She offered no more explanation, and the father, unwilling to push, changed the subject. But later that night, when the hum of machinery rose once more from behind the locked door, the parents lay awake side by side, each staring into the dark ceiling above, each silently wishing the other would say what they both feared, that something was happening in their daughter's room, something they no longer understood. The whispers in the hallway grew into a constant presence. By day the house looked unchanged, but by night it became a place where mystery pulsed through the walls. And though they said nothing aloud, both parents knew the truth. Their daughter's room no longer belonged entirely to her. It belonged to whatever secret she was keeping, a secret that was alive and growing stronger with each passing night. It began with small requests, the kind any teenager might make. She asked that they knock before coming into her room. Then soon after that they wait until she answered before opening the door. Within days, the request became commands spoken with a firmness that startled her parents. By the end of the month, an unspoken rule had taken hold of the household. No one entered her room, not at night, Not during the day, not at all. The space at the end of the hall had become hers alone, sealed behind a lock and guarded by silence. The curtains were always drawn now. In the mornings, when sunlight slanted across the neighborhood lawns, her windows remained dark, the heavy fabric hiding whatever might be unfolding within. At first, her mother tried to open them while changing the sheets, but she was stopped at the door by a sharp, almost panicked protest. "Please don't. I'll take care of it." The words were enough to end the conversation, and after that, no one tried again. From the street, neighbors began to notice. Every other window in the house glowed with daylight, but hers remained blank, a blind rectangle that made the whole house seem watchful. Meals changed next, where once she had joined them for dinner. Sitting at the table with her elbows tucked in and her eyes lowered, now she asked if she could eat in her room. It was at first excused as studying, then as tiredness, then as a phase that would pass. But it did not pass. Plates began to appear on a tray left just outside her door, knocked on lightly, and retrieved later, sometimes empty, sometimes barely touched. Her parents told themselves it was temporary, a mark of adolescence. But in quiet moments they admitted to each other that their home had begun to feel divided, as if one room had been walled off into another world. Excuses accumulated quickly. She could not help with chores because she was studying. She could not join them on errands because she was busy. She could not let them in to fix a window latch or check the smoke detector because it was fine. The more she explained, the less believable it became. The words felt rehearsed, as if they were drawn from a script she repeated to protect something she would not name. Her parents listened, nodded, and each time told themselves not to press too hard. But with each excuse, the distance grew. They began to notice how carefully she monitored the hallway. If her mother lingered too long outside the door, even without knocking, the sound of footsteps would immediately move closer from inside, shadowing her presence as if to remind her she was not welcome. If her father tried to handle absent-mindedly, just to see, her voice would rise sharp from the other side. Don't. There was no anger in it, but there was no negotiation either. The word was final. On weekends, when the family once moved to the house together, cleaning or working on small projects, her absence left a hollow space. Rooms seemed quieter, conversations shorter. Her laughter, once an occasional thread in the fabric of daily life, was gone, replaced by the closed door and the rules she enforced with surprising discipline. Even the dog seemed to sense it, scratching at her door only once before retreating, as though recognizing that the line was not to be crossed. Her parents told no one outside the house. To admit it would sound strange, even shameful, that they allowed their daughter to live in isolation under their own roof. Instead, they kept it to themselves, watching the door, waiting for a sign that she would invite them back in. But none came. What frightened them most was not the rules themselves, but the ease with which she had imposed them. Rules that had never existed before now governed their lives, and they had accepted them without protest. It was as though the balance of the household had quietly shifted, and the authority they thought they still held had been passed to the girl behind the locked door. They lay awake at night, turning over the same unspoken question. What was worth guarding so fiercely that even family could not be trusted to see it? It was a Sunday morning when the father first noticed a change. He had gone upstairs with a basket of laundry, balancing it against his hip as he stopped by his daughter's door. Out of habit, he tried the handle, expecting to be locked in the usual way. But this time the handle barely moved at all. The mechanism was stiff, unyielding, and when he leaned his shoulder into the door just slightly, the frame itself held firmer than it should have. He frowned, setting the basket down, and tried again with more pressure. The resistance was not the kind that came from a simple lock. Something else had been added. When he mentioned it to his wife later that day, she tested it herself, knocking first and then attempting to turn the handle when no answer came. It was the same for her, an unnatural heaviness in the door, as if it had been braced from inside. They exchanged a long look in the hallway, both reluctant to admit what it meant. Their daughter had not only locked the door, she had modified it. The question was when. Neither of them could remember a moment when she had carried tools upstairs, or a package of hardware, or even the sound of hammering or drilling that would have been impossible to ignore in such a quiet house. And yet the evidence was there. The brass knob no longer fit flush with the wood, The edges of the strike plate were freshly scratched, and the frame bore faint marks as if screws had been tightened more than once. That night, the father sat at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring at a half-finished cup of coffee and trying to piece together the timeline. He remembered that 6 weeks earlier, the door had creaked on its hinges and he had promised to oil it. When he finally did, the lock had worked normally. Somewhere between then and now, the change had been made. His daughter had managed to alter the hardware of her door without their knowledge, and the realization unsettled him more than the locked door itself. They began to test it cautiously over the next few days, choosing times when she was at school or distracted. But each attempt ended the same way. The door would not budge. It was more than just a bolt. There was weight behind it, a resistance that suggested reinforcement from the inside. The father suspected she had installed a second lock, perhaps even a bar across the frame, though he could not imagine how she had acquired the materials. The mother wondered aloud if she had been sneaking things into the house under their noses, hidden among school supplies or tucked into her backpack. The idea made them feel foolish, as though their own home had been turned against them. One afternoon, the mother crouched near the floorboards and pressed her cheek to the narrow gap beneath the door, though it smelled faintly of metal, sharper than dust, and from within came the muted impression of something solid pressed against the frame. She whispered their daughter's name softly, but the only reply was a hush of silence, the kind that feels deliberate. At dinner that evening, the conversation turned to safety, the parents circling around their concern without confronting it directly. The father spoke of fire hazards, how a locked and reinforced door could trap someone inside. The mother added that it made her uneasy not knowing how quickly they could reach her if something went wrong. Their daughter listened without raising her eyes from her plate. When she finally did speak, it was with the same calm tone she always used now. "I'm safe. That's all that matters." No further explanation, no apology. Just that, afterward, when she returned to her room, and the sound of the lock sliding into place echoed down the hallway, the parents sat in the living room without speaking. They both felt the weight of the truth pressing in on them. Their daughter had created a barrier they no longer had the key to open, both literally and in ways they could not yet define. And somewhere in the silence between them, each parent realized the same unsettling thought. If she could build a lock strong enough to keep them out, what else had she been building behind that closed door? It was late on a Thursday when the first phone call came, a neighbor from across the street. Her voice lowered as if confessing a sin, mentioned she had noticed a strange glow in their daughter's window the night before. Not a lamp or the bluish wash of a television, but a stuttering light, pulsing in uneven intervals, bright enough to cast shapes against the drawn curtains. The mother laughed politely and brushed it off, thanking her for concern, but when she hung up the phone, her hand lingered on the receiver longer than necessary. She told herself it was nothing, perhaps a flashlight, perhaps a reflection. Still, she found herself standing at the kitchen window that night, staring up at the curtained glass, waiting for the light to return. It did, around midnight. The window flared briefly, as if someone had switched on a welding torch behind the curtain. The light quivered, then dimmed, then flared again in bursts that looked purposeful, almost coded. The mother called her husband over, and together they stood in silence, watching the glow slip across the fabric before disappearing altogether. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, but the unease settled heavier than ever over the house. By the weekend, the whispers had spread. At the grocery store, a cashier asked casually if everything was all right at home, remarking that the neighborhood kids had started daring each other to walk past the house after dark. At church on Sunday, 2 women huddled near the door asked the mother if her daughter was experimenting with things she shouldn't be. The questions were half-cloaked in concern but sharpened with judgment, their smiles tight, their voices lowered to a murmur. The father tried to shrug it off. "People gossip when they don't understand," he said, though his words carried more frustration than conviction. But the gossip was no longer easy to ignore. A neighbor suggested that perhaps the girl had friends sneaking in late at night, using her room as a gathering place. Another said she had seen movement at the window, shadows that didn't match the shape of a single person. Someone else wondered if she was involved in something darker. Things whispered with a glance over the shoulder and a shake of the head, as though naming it outright might make it real. The The parents found themselves defending her more often, repeating lines they weren't sure they believed. She was just studying. She was working on school projects. She was shy and needed space. Each defense felt thinner than the last. They began avoiding eye contact when neighbors asked too many questions, offering quick excuses before retreating into the house where the questions only grew louder in their own minds. One night, the father tried to reassure himself by standing in the yard and staring up at the window. The curtains were drawn tight, but when the light flickered again, it spilled faintly around the edges, outlining the frame with a ghostly glow. He felt suddenly as though the entire street could see it, that the house itself was betraying their secret, exposing what they had been unwilling to confront. He walked back inside, closing the blind behind him, as if shutting out the view could erase what others had already seen. The mother grew more restless. She lingered by the phone, half expecting another call, half dreading it. She stopped gardening in the front yard, unwilling to hear the whispers carried too casually over fences. And when the light returned again, brighter than before, she pressed her hand to the wall beneath their daughter's room, as though she might feel the answer through the plaster. The rumors had escaped their control, and with them came a realization neither parent wanted a voice. The locked door, the strange noises, the flickering light, these were no longer just their family's private concern. The entire neighborhood was watching, waiting, inventing stories to fill the silence. And the silence was becoming unbearable. The night she wrote the letter, the house had already fallen into its familiar quiet. The father had gone to bed early, worn down by another long day at work. But the mother lingered in the kitchen, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as though she could see through the floorboards into the locked room above. The flickering light had returned that evening, pulsing against the drawn curtains in strange, uneven bursts, and with it came the gnawing certainty that something inside was being hidden from them. She tried to tell herself again that it was normal teenage privacy, that secrets were a rite of passage, but the silence behind that door no longer felt ordinary. It felt deliberate, heavy, and unyielding. She found herself sitting at the table with a sheet of paper and a pen, her hand hovering for several minutes before she began to write. The words came haltingly, almost as if she feared her daughter might somehow hear them even before they were written. Asterisk, please, sweetheart. We're worried. Just tell us if you're all right. We won't be angry. We only want the truth. Asterisk, she paused, the ink pooling slightly at the tip of the pen, before adding one final plea. Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone. Folding the note in half, she walked down the hallway on quiet feet. The house was still, the kind of stillness that magnifies the smallest sound, and she hesitated before sliding the letter beneath the door. The paper whispered softly as it crossed the threshold into the locker room, vanishing under the crack as though swallowed by the very silence she was trying to break. She lingered a moment, her hand resting against the wood, then turned away and went back to bed. The hours that followed were long and restless. She lay awake listening for any sign, a shift in the floorboards, the creak of the bed, the rustle of paper. But the hallway remained silent. At some point she drifted into uneasy sleep, only to wake before dawn with the sense that something had changed. She rose quietly, careful not to disturb her husband, and made her way back to the door. There, just where she had left her letter, lay another. The paper had been pushed back out, folded into a neat rectangle, her daughter's handwriting scrawled across it in lines that trembled with haste. She picked it up with unsteady hands and opened it under the weak glow of the hallway light. The message was short, only one line, but it seemed to echo louder than any explanation could have. Asterisk, not yet. Please trust me. Asterisk. The word struck her like both comfort and warning. Her daughter was alive, aware and reaching out, but the refusal was clear. Whatever secret she was guarding, it was not ready to be shared. The handwriting itself unsettled her almost as much as a message. The strokes uneven, the pressure heavy in places, as though written in a rush or under strain. It was her daughter's hand, but it carried a weight of secrecy that felt far older than 14. She stood there for a long time, the note trembling between her fingers. She wanted to wake her husband, to share the message and let the burden of it rest on both of them. But instead, she folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of her nightstand. For reasons she could not quite explain, she felt the need to protect it, to keep it hidden even from him. That morning, When their daughter came downstairs briefly to collect her breakfast plate, her face showed no sign of what had passed in the night. She spoke little, ate less, and vanished once again into the locked room. The mother watched her go, the note's words circling endlessly in her mind. Asterisk, not yet. Please trust me. Asterisk, they were both a promise and a warning, and for the first time she realized the mystery had grown beyond locked doors and flickering lights. It had become a test of patience, of faith, and of how long a parent could wait when the truth pressed so insistently at the edges of their own home. The silence began the very next night. It fell over the hallway with a weight that neither parent could ignore, and it lingered so completely that even the usual creaks of the floorboards seemed to vanish. Where once there had been faint scratching, muffled voices, and the hum of hidden machinery, now there was nothing at all. The door remained locked as always, the curtains drawn, the tray of food left outside and later collected, but the room behind it offered no sound. On the first evening, they told themselves she was tired, perhaps finally catching up on the sleep she had been neglecting. The father even remarked that it was a relief not to hear the strange noises anymore, but his words rang hollow. The mother could not shake the feeling that the sudden quiet was worse. She lay awake listening to the hallway and found it unbearable. A house always has its rhythm, its small proofs of life. Steps across a bedroom floor, drawers opening, the faint shuffle of movement. When those sounds are gone, the silence does not soothe. It presses like a hand against the chest. By the second day, the tension had become impossible to ignore. The tray of food came back untouched, not even disturbed, as though it had never been collected. When the mother knocked softly, there was no answer, not even the shift of weight from inside the room to suggest someone had heard. She tried again, louder, her voice trembling as she called her daughter's name. Still, nothing. The father tried the handle, rattling it harder than he intended, but the door held firm and the room behind it remained mute. They stood together in the hallway, exchanging a glance that revealed more than either wanted to admit. The silence stretched on. At night, they took turns listening at the door, straining to catch even the smallest breath or sigh. But there was only stillness, the kind that seems to grow thicker the longer one listens. Even the dog, once curious about the room, stopped sniffing at the crack beneath the door and retreated, curling instead at the bottom of the stairs as though the upstairs had ceased to exist. Neighbors continued to ask casual questions, their tones sharpening when told everything was fine. The parents gave the same practiced reassurances, but their voices lacked conviction. Each word felt like a lie, because deep down they were no longer certain if everything was fine. At night, the mother began writing in her journal again, a habit she had abandoned years ago, filling pages with notes about what she did or did not hear. She logged the hours of silence, the untouched meals, the lack of footsteps. Her handwriting grew smaller, tighter, as if compressing the unease into the paper would keep it from spilling into the rest of the house. On the fourth day, the father pressed his ear to the door for so long that his neck stiffened. He told himself he was imagining it, but he thought he felt a faint vibration against the wood, like a heartbeat too far away to confirm. He pulled back quickly, ashamed of his own fear, but he could not shake the thought that whatever had filled the room before had simply withdrawn deeper, beyond their reach. The silence was no longer absence. It was presence, unbroken, deliberate, and heavy with meaning. It sat between them at the dinner table, followed them through the rooms of the house, and seeped into their sleep. And in the quiet, they began to wonder if their daughter's note had not been reassurance at all, but warning. Asterisk, not yet. Please trust me. Asterisk, now there was nothing to trust. Only the thick and unyielding silence of a door that no longer gave them proof of the life it concealed. The breaking point came on a Wednesday morning. The alarm clock had rung in the parents' bedroom, but there was no sound of movement from down the hall. Normally, even in her silence, their daughter could be counted on to emerge at least briefly before school, collecting her books, slipping past them with her backpack hugged close, offering only the briefest acknowledgement before vanishing again. That morning, the door stayed shut. The minutes ticked past. The bus groaned its way down the street and stopped, idling for longer than usual, then moved on without her. The father knocked firmly, his knuckles echoing in the still corridor. "It's time for school," he called, keeping his voice steady. No answer came. He tried again, louder this time, but the only response was the hush of the house itself. The mother set down her coffee, her hand trembling slightly as she moved closer, pressing her ear to the door. Nothing, not even the faint shuffle of movement that once betrayed her daughter's presence. By evening, the tray of food they had left outside her door remained untouched. The glass of water stood unclouded, condensation long since faded. The mother bent to pick it up, staring at the full plate as if it were an accusation. "She didn't take anything," she whispered, her voice caught between fear and disbelief. That night they waited again, listening for footsteps, for voices, for the mechanical hum that once unnerved them. But the silence endured. The father paced the living room, muttering that she was testing boundaries, pushing him to see how far she could go. The mother disagreed. She spoke of danger, of sickness, of the possibility that something had gone wrong inside that sealed room. Each argument circled back to the same unspoken dread. They no longer knew what was happening behind the door. By the second morning, she still had not emerged. She missed another day of school, another series of meals. The mother sat at the kitchen table with the phone in her hand, debating whether to call the school, the doctor, or even the police. Each option felt like both an overreaction and not enough. Her husband urged caution, insisting that their daughter's words still echoed. Asterisk, not yet. Please trust me. Asterisk, but trust, under the weight of silence, was becoming harder to defend. That evening they stood together in the hallway outside her room. The air felt heavier there, as though the locked door radiated something oppressive. The mother knocked again, her voice breaking this time as she begged for a reply. "Please, just say something. Anything." Only silence answered. The father placed his hand on the knob, feeling the resistance of the reinforced lock. He hesitated, torn between the promise of respecting her privacy and the duty of protecting her life. They looked at each other in the dim light of the hallway, both waiting for the other to decide. Finally, the mother spoke. "If we don't act and something has happened to her, we'll never forgive ourselves." The father closed his eyes, leaning his forehead briefly against the door, before straightening and nodding. The decision settled between them with the weight of inevitability. That night, for the first time, they allowed themselves to see the locked door not as a boundary to be respected, but as a barrier that might need to be broken. They did not yet act, but the choice had been made. The silence on the other side had forced it. Privacy had carried them this far, but safety, they now realized, demanded something more. The decision was no longer one they could postpone. After 2 days of untouched food, unanswered knocks, and the suffocating silence that filled the upper hallway, the father finally fetched his toolbox from the garage. He carried it up the stairs slowly, each step heavy with dread, as if the weight of the metal box matched the weight of what he was about to do. The mother followed behind him, her arms wrapped tightly across her chest, her eyes never leaving the door at the end of the hall. They stood before it together. The door looked ordinary enough in the dim light, its white paint scuffed near the handle from years of use, but both of them knew it had become something far more than wood and hinges. It was a barrier their daughter had built, a barrier she had asked them not to cross. And now, by their own decision, they were about to tear it down. The father placed the toolbox on the floor, knelt, and studied the lock. It had been modified. There was no doubt about it. Extra screws lined the strike plate. Fresh scratches marred the metal, and the knob itself felt sturdier than it once had. He tried the handle one last time, as though hoping it might yield suddenly, but it held as firmly as ever. He pulled out a screwdriver, slid it against the screws, and worked in silence. The sound of metal against metal scraped down the hallway, louder than either of them expected. When that failed, he reached for the crowbar. He wedged it against the frame and leaned his weight into it, his jaw tight, his breath shallow. Though it groaned, then splintered. Still, the lock held. He tried again, harder this time, until suddenly there was a crack, a violent snap that seemed to echo through the entire house. The lock gave way. The door shuddered, and the sound of it breaking seemed louder than thunder in the silence. For a moment, neither of them moved. The mother pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide, as if the very act of breaking the lock had changed the shape of their world. The father pushed the door open slowly, cautiously, and the air that spilled out struck them immediately. It smelled of dust and paper, of solder and scorched wires, a sharp metallic tang that filled the back of the throat. Inside, the room was dim. The curtains were drawn tight, the only light coming from a desk lamp left burning on the far side of the room. Papers littered every surface, stacked in uneven piles, some yellow with age, others marked with strange symbols and sketches that neither parent could immediately understand. A half-built device of wires and circuit boards sat on the desk, its soldering iron resting nearby, cold but stained with the black residue of use. The floor was covered with notebooks, some open, their pages filled with dense writing, calculations, and diagrams. The walls, once plain, were now covered with taped sheets of graph paper, crude maps, and hand-drawn blueprints. It was not a bedroom anymore. It was something else entirely. The parents stepped carefully inside, their shoes crunching faintly on stray bits of metal and paper clips. The silence in the room was even heavier than in the hallway, as though whatever activity had once filled it had been deliberately abandoned. The mother picked up one of the notebooks from the floor, her fingers trembling. The handwriting was their daughter's, but the words were technical, filled with numbers and terms she did not recognize. She set it down quickly, unsettled by the realization that her daughter had been working on something they could not even begin to comprehend. The father ran his hand along the desk, tracing the edge of the machine that sat there. He did not know what was meant to be, only that it was unfinished, its wires trailing like veins without a body to contain them. He looked around the room again, his chest tight, and for the first time he felt a fear that went beyond worry. This was not rebellion, not a child hobby hidden away. This was intention. The mother whispered her daughter's name into the still air, but no reply came. The room, for all its chaos, was empty. Only the smell of solder, the piles of paper, and the broken lock behind them bore witness to what they had done. The room they stepped into was not the room they remembered. It no longer resembled the space where their daughter had once slept beneath posters and fairy lights, her belongings scattered in the careless way of adolescence. Instead, it was transformed into something that felt closer to a workshop, a place designed for secrecy and purpose rather than comfort. The air was stale, heavy with the lingering odor of solder and burned insulation. Dust mixed with a metallic tang, and a faint hum seemed to resonate in the walls, even though no device appeared to be running. The walls were the first thing they noticed. Every surface was covered, not with decorations or photographs, but with paper. Sheets of graph paper, notebook pages torn out, and loose scraps had been taped in neat, almost obsessive rows. Each one was filled with drawings, numbers, and codes they could not decipher. Some were diagrams of machines, sketched in sharp lines with careful notes written in the margins. Others resembled maps, but they were incomplete, fragmented into sections labeled with letters and numbers instead of place names. In between them were pages of what looked like codes, columns of symbols, letters rearranged into patterns that made no immediate sense. The desk against the far wall was buried under a tangle of wires, circuit boards, and dismantled electronics. Old radios, clock parts, and what looked like pieces of discarded computers had been stripped and reorganized into devices that seemed both crude and precise. One small box was filled with batteries taped together in strange configurations. Another with spools of copper, wire wound tightly, as though prepared for some larger design. A soldering iron lay across a heat-stained mat, its cord coiled like a snake, and beside it sat a magnifying glass smeared with fingerprints. The bed was pushed into the corner, half buried beneath more papers and notebooks. It looked more like a storage surface than a place to sleep. The blankets were rumpled, covered with loose sheets filled with equations and sketches of circuitry. The pillow bore the indent of a head, but it was lost beneath a stack of journals bound in black tape. Her nightstand, once home to books and a lamp, now supported what looked like the shell of a broken drone, its rotors removed and wires spilling out like veins. On the floor lay open boxes, each labeled in her handwriting. Some read tools, others spare parts, and one, more carefully sealed, carried the word private written 3 times across the top. The mother crouched to examine it, but did not open it, her hand hovering over the tape lid, as though touching it might cross a boundary she was not ready to break. The father moved slowly through the room, his eyes darting from wall to wall, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of material. It was not the disarray of a hobbyist. It was methodical, systematic. Everything was cataloged, sorted, arranged in a way that suggested long hours of work, a discipline he had never associated with his daughter before. He picked up a page from the desk, turning it toward the light. It contained a diagram of a circuit labeled with numbers and arrows, but the annotations were written in a shorthand he could not decipher. He set it down quickly, disturbed by the realization that she had been operating in a world of knowledge beyond their comprehension. The silence in the room pressed on them. The mother whispered, almost to herself, "This isn't a bedroom anymore." Her words hung there, true and undeniable. The space had been remade into something private and powerful, a hidden world where their daughter had been living without them. Everywhere they looked, they found evidence of intention, tools sharpened by use, notes rewritten multiple times, devices that had been dismantled and rebuilt. It was a laboratory built from scraps and secrecy, and it left them with the unsettling sense that they were intruders in a world they were never meant to see. For the first time since forcing the door, both parents felt the weight of what their daughter had created. It was not rebellion, not a childish attempt to defy rules. It was purpose. And the longer they stood inside that hidden world, the more they realized they no longer knew their own child at all. The journal sat half-buried under loose papers and tangled wires, its dark leather cover standing out against the clutter of the desk. Unlike the scattered notes taped to the walls or the half-finished sketches that littered the floor, this book had weight to it, a presence that seemed deliberate. The mother reached for it hesitantly, her fingertips brushing dust from its surface before lifting it free. The leather was worn, the edges frayed, and the clasp at its side had been replaced with a simple loop of string, tied and untied many times. She opened it slowly, almost afraid of what she might find inside. The first pages were filled with dates written in the upper corners, each one accompanied by lines of cramped handwriting. The ink varied, sometimes faint and shaky, other times heavy and pressed deep into the paper. The entries did not read like a diary of daily life, but more like a record of thought, an archive of things her daughter had been tracking and solving. The first section described patterns. Rows of numbers ran down the page, connected by arrows and annotations. Beneath them, words like frequency, intervals, and cycles repeated again and again. Small sketches of shapes, circles intersecting with lines, accompanied the notes. To the parents, it looked like mathematics, though written in a shorthand they could not fully grasp. The mother turned the page and found another filled with graphs drawn by hand, the peaks and valleys labeled with times of day, moon phases, even weather conditions. It was as though their daughter had been studying rhythms invisible to everyone else. Further into the journal, the writing grew denser, accompanied by sketches of devices. She had drawn them in layers, showing how each piece connected to the next, with careful notes about what worked and what failed. In the margins were corrections, sometimes crossed out so violently the paper nearly tore. Words like reset, calibrate, and stability appeared over and over. It was a language of trial and error, of someone building toward a solution they could not yet see. Then the tone shifted. Interspersed among the technical notes were fragments of warnings written in hurried strokes. Don't repeat the mistake. Do not let them see until it is ready. Test only when a house is quiet. Some pages carried single phrases written over and over, filling the paper as though she had needed to remind herself. Trust the pattern, not the noise. Stay hidden. The parents exchanged uneasy glances as they read. This was not the casual scribbling of a curious teenager. It was a record of discipline, of obsession, of something pursued in secrecy. The warnings unsettled them most. Who was she writing them for? Were they meant as reminders to herself, or had she imagined an audience watching her work? One she needed to keep at bay? Toward the back of the journal, the entries became shorter, more fragmented. Dates were left blank. Words trailed off mid-sentence. Diagrams were unfinished. Arrows left pointing toward empty space. The final pages were filled with sketches of overlapping shapes and coded symbols, accompanied by a single line scrawled in darker ink. Asterisk, not yet. Don't reveal it. Not until it's certain. Asterisk. The mother closed the book slowly, her hands trembling as she held it. The weight of it was not just physical. It carried the burden of a mind working far beyond their understanding, a child caught in patterns and warnings that no one else had seen. The father leaned against the desk, his eyes fixed on the journal, as if it might still be hiding more. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The silence in the room was thick, but the journal's words seemed to echo inside it, louder than any sound. Their daughter had been writing not just to understand, but to protect, guarding something she believed must remain hidden. And now, in opening the book, they felt they had stepped deeper into a secret that was no longer hers alone, but theirs to carry as well. The parents turned from the desk and let their eyes sweep across the walls again, this time with a sharper focus. At first glance, the diagrams and scraps of paper seemed like chaos. Taped up notes in no particular order, half-finished sketches cluttering every inch of space. But as they moved closer, they realized there was structure, a deliberate layering of information. Sheets overlapped like tiles, arranged to form a patchwork of interconnected thoughts that spanned every wall. Their daughter had transformed the room into a map of her own mind, one they could not read. The father leaned toward a cluster of diagrams drawn on graph paper. Each one was a circuit, inked in dark lines with arrows indicating flow. But they were not the simple designs of a school project. These were dense, intricate patterns of resistors, capacitors, and wires looping in ways that looked unconventional, even unstable. Some had notes scrawled beside them, asterisk too much heat, stable for 2 minutes, needs shielding, asterisk others were simply marked with an X, as if discarded. He knew enough to recognize the symbols, but not enough to guess their purpose. On the opposite wall hung something stranger still, a series of star charts. They had been traced by hand, constellations mapped out in careful lines, with annotations marking not only the names of stars, but also numbers, dates, times, intervals that seemed to form a sequence. One page in particular caught the mother's attention. The constellation was familiar, Orion, but it was surrounded by arrows and circles, notes written in margin, asterisk alignment incomplete, wait for convergence. Asterisk, she traced the words with her finger, unsettled by the thought that her daughter had been watching the sky as intently as she had been studying machines. Between the circuits and the stars were blueprints, though they hardly looked like anything recognizable. Machines of her own design had been sketched in multiple views. Side, top, cross sections filled with details. Some resembled boxes with protruding rods and wires. Others looked almost like antennae or towers. Each was labeled with names that offered no clarity. Asterisk receiver 3 asterisk. Prototype F asterisk not for them. Not yet. Asterisk, the repeated phrase was scrawled in different hand pressures, sometimes faint, sometimes gouged deep into the paper. It appeared again and again across multiple sheets, a refrain that seemed to guard whatever she was building. The parents moved slowly, their eyes drawn to fragments they could not make sense of. A set of arrows connecting a circuit diagram to a star chart, a list of materials, copper wire, magnets, batteries, checked off in neat boxes. A page filled only with a spiral drawn over and over, layered until the paper nearly tore. The mother whispered that it looked like obsession, but the father shook his head. It looked more like purpose. The strangeness of it unsettled them most. These were not doodles, not idle experiments. They were plans, drafted carefully, revised repeatedly. Each paper seemed to connect to another, though in ways they could not understand. They were looking at the skeleton of something larger, something that stretched beyond their comprehension. The mother stopped at one page taped slightly higher than the rest. It contained only words written in block letters, asterisk not ready. Don't reveal it. Not for them. Not yet. Asterisk, the repetition of the phrase, already scattered across the walls, now stared back at her directly. It was not just a reminder to herself. It felt like a barrier drawn in ink, a message meant for anyone who might stumble into the room. She felt suddenly like an intruder, reading words she was never meant to see. They stepped back, overwhelmed, the room closing in around them. The papers seemed alive, whispering with secrets they could not decipher. Each diagram, each note, carried the weight of meaning, but that meaning remained just out of reach. They felt like outsiders peering into a hidden world, their daughter's world, where machines and stars and codes spoke a language she alone understood. And at the center of it all, written again and again, was a reminder that what they had uncovered was not meant for them. Not yet. The mother was the first to notice the corner of a box sticking out from beneath the bed. It was barely visible under the uneven layers of notebooks and blankets that had been pushed aside, but the sight of cardboard where there should have been only fabric made her pause. She crouched down, the dust gathering on her knees, and reached for it. The father bent beside her, steadying the stack of papers as she dragged it out. What emerged was heavier than it looked, a long box sealed with strips of tape and marked in her daughter's handwriting. Components AC. When they peeled back the lid, the inside revealed rows of dismantled radios, their plastic casings cracked open, wires spilling like veins across the cardboard. Some pieces were neatly bundled together with rubber bands, others stacked in small paper envelopes marked with labels: asterisk transistors, asterisk, copper coils, amplifiers. Each fragment had been salvaged, stripped down, and preserved as though she had been harvesting raw materials from discarded machines. They slid out another box. This one was filled with salvaged wires, twisted in spools of red, blue, and black. The ends had been carefully stripped as if prepared for use. A smaller box inside carried a single word scrawled across the top in uneven letters: tested. Inside, they found small hand-built prototypes, crude devices made from scrap, circuits glued to wood, batteries bound together with tape, small bulbs that flickered faintly when jostled. Each had been labeled with notes written on slips of paper. Shorted after 4 minutes. Stable until overload. Try shielding next time. The farther they searched, the clearer the pattern became. Each box carried a purpose. One was labeled spares, another failed, another TO revise. The category suggested she had been working systematically, each experiment leading to the next, each failure recorded and stored for later reflection. This was not the chaos of a child tinkering for amusement. It was the discipline of someone building towards something larger. The mother's hands trembled as she lifted one of the prototypes from the box. It was nothing more than a circuit board fused to the inside of a metal tin, wires branching outward into a coil that wrapped around a small glass bulb. But the notes beside it read, asterisk receives weekly. Noise increases at night. Asterisk, she said it back quickly, unsettled by the suggestion that her daughter had not only built it, but had been testing it, documenting the results in detail. They pulled out another box, smaller and taped twice across the top. When they opened it, they found pages folded carefully around objects wrapped in cloth. Inside were fragments of metal, some etched with symbols neither parent recognized, others shaped into precise forms, as if machined for a purpose beyond their understanding. The labels inside this box were different, less clinical, more guarded. Asterisk not ready. Dangerous if misused. Asterisk the words chilled them, written in the same familiar handwriting, but carrying a weight that felt alien coming from their daughter. The father sat back on his heels, staring at the growing pile of boxes. She's been collecting all of this, he said quietly, his voice thick with disbelief. The mother nodded, unable to find her own words. The truth was undeniable. Their daughter had been working in secret for far longer than they realized, building something piece by piece, hidden beneath the very bed they had once tucked her into at night. The silence of the room pressed in as they absorbed the discovery. Each box revealed not only the evidence of her work, but also the scale of her secrecy. She had hidden all of this from them, from her teachers, from her friends, from everyone. It was a secret that belonged to her alone, a hidden world growing in the shadows of their own home. And though they sifted through the parts and labels, though they touched the prototypes and read the notes, they could not grasp the whole. Each piece suggested a purpose, but the larger design remained out of reach, just beyond what they could see. What unsettled them most was not the clutter of salvaged parts, but the realization that their daughter had been working towards something vast, something she had guarded fiercely, something she believed they were not meant to know. They were still kneeling on the floor, surrounded by open boxes and scattered prototypes, when the sound of the hinges cut through the silence. The parents froze, their heads turning in unison toward the doorway. She was standing there, her hand resting lightly on the frame, her face calm but unreadable. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air between them seemed to thicken, as if the very house was holding its breath. Her eyes moved over the scene. The boxes dragged from beneath the bed. The paper shuffled out of order. The journal left ajar on the desk. She did not shout, did not panic, did not even rush forward to stop them. She only stood there, steady and composed, watching as if she had been expecting this moment all along. The mother rose to her feet, the note of apology already forming in her throat. But before she could speak, the girl's voice cut across the room. "You weren't supposed to see this yet." The words landed heavier than any explanation could have. They were not defensive, not angry. They were simply matter of fact, spoken with a certainty that unsettled them more than any outburst would have. She looked at her parents as if they had crossed a boundary she had carefully set, as though their presence in her private world was not only premature but dangerous. The father straightened slowly, his hands brushing dust from his palms. He opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss. What could he say? That they were worried? That they had broken the lock because they feared for her? None of it seemed enough. He glanced toward the journal on the desk, toward the circuits pinned to the wall, then back at his daughter's expressionless face. The mother took a cautious step forward, her voice soft. "Then when?" she asked gently. "When were we supposed to see it?" But the girl offered no answer. Her gaze flickered toward the boxes, then toward the scrawled warnings taped across the walls. Asterisk, not yet, not for them, not ready. Asterisk, she seemed to be reminding them silently that the words were written for this very moment. She moved into the room at last, her presence filling the space in a way that made the parents feel like intruders. Her steps were quiet, deliberate, as she began to gather papers from the floor, stacking them neatly as though restoring order after an unwelcome disturbance. The soldering iron on the desk caught the faint light of the lamp, and she adjusted it back into place with practiced ease. Neither parent moved to stop her. They only watched, uncertain, their unease deepening with every gesture. The girl carried herself with composure far beyond her years, her silence heavier than any explanation they might have hoped for. She seemed not like a child caught in secrecy, but like a keeper of something larger, something she believed was not yet ready to be shared. The father finally found his voice, though it emerged quieter than he intended. "You scared us," he said. His words trembled with both fear and relief. The girl paused, her hand resting on a stack of notes. For a moment, her expression softened. But then she shook her head slightly, her calm returning like a mask. "You weren't supposed to see this yet," she repeated, almost to herself this time, as if reaffirming the boundary they had broken. And with that, she turned back to her work, leaving her parents standing in the middle of the room, outsiders in a space they could no longer claim as part of their own home. The room was still heavy with tension, the silence stretching between the parents and their daughter like a line that could snap at any moment. She stood by the desk now, her hands resting lightly on the edges of her notes, her shoulders squared as though she had been preparing for this confrontation long before it arrived. The words she had spoken, asterisk, "You weren't supposed to see this yet," asterisk, still hung in the air unfinished, demanding something more. At last, she seemed to understand that they would not leave without an explanation. Her eyes lifted from the clutter to meet theirs. There was no anger in them, only a calm steadiness that unsettled her parents more than rage ever could. "It isn't for me," she said quietly. The sentence seemed to drift in the air, simple but impossible to grasp. She gestured toward the boxes on the floor, the wires spilling from their sides, the circuit diagrams taped across the walls. "It's for them." Her parents exchanged a look, confusion mirrored in both their faces. The father's voice came first, rough and uncertain. "For who? What are you talking about?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into one of the boxes and pulled out a small prototype, a crude arrangement of wires and metal pieces fixed into a battered tin. She placed it gently on the desk, her fingers brushing the coil as though it were fragile. "This can take a signal no one else listens for," she said, "and it can send one back." She opened a notebook, flipping to a page covered in scrawled numbers and diagrams. "I've been testing how far it can reach, how clear it can be. I don't want it for myself. I want it for people who don't have anyone listening to them." The words carried weight her parents did not expect. The mother moved closer, reading the notes without understanding them. "You mean radios? Communication?" she asked. The girl nodded but kept her eyes on the prototype. "But not like what we already have. This is different, smaller, stronger, and cheap. Anyone could build it if they knew how. It doesn't belong to me. It belongs to everyone who needs a voice." The father struggled to find words. His mind had been braced for danger, for evidence of obsession, for proof of some threat concealed in their own home. Instead, he was confronted with a vision he did not fully comprehend, a project driven not by rebellion, but by intent. He watched his daughter's hands as she carefully reassembled a wire that had come loose. She moved with a focus that reminded him suddenly of his own father's workshop years ago. The same discipline, the same patience. The mother lowered herself into a chair beside the desk, her eyes scanning the diagrams. "You've been doing this for others?" she asked softly. "Not for yourself?" The girl finally looked up at her, the faintest trace of emotion breaking through her calm. "For people who don't get heard. For those who don't have what we do. If I finish it, they can talk to each other. They won't be alone anymore." The room seemed to shift around those words. The fear that had wrapped itself around the parents began to loosen, replaced by something else, a hesitant recognition that what they had mistaken for secrecy and defiance was something far different. It was not a wall to shut them out, but a shelter for something larger than all of them. They stood in her private world, surrounded by the scattered evidence of months of hidden work. And for the first time, they saw not just a locked door, not just a secrecy, but the purpose that had driven it. Their daughter had not been building a fortress against them. She had been building a bridge for others. The father exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders. The mother reached across the desk, her hand brushing her daughter's sleeve, hesitant but tender. And in that quiet moment, they realized that everything had changed. Their fear had been replaced with awe. Their suspicion with an understanding that the girl they thought they knew had grown into something more than they had ever imagined. She had been carrying a truth far larger than herself, and now it belonged to them too.